I heard a great quote from the CEO of Starbucks, Kevin Johnson, and he called this new era post-virus the great human reconnection. And I just love that because to me, retail is always about that intersection of delivering value and human interaction. And so this idea of the great human reconnection really resonated with me.
What are the biggest challenges organizations need to overcome on the path towards an omnichannel shopping experience today?
There are really three big challenges today, in my opinion, as I see them. And again, this is based on my direct experience as well. The first one is the organizational structure of retailers themselves, right? And so what I always like to do when you start talking about the challenges of omni-channel or digital initiatives, we have a tendency to kind of focus just on that pilot. And I want to challenge you and anyone listening today, let's take a step back. I mean, way, way back, right? And here's an example of what I'm talking about. It's common in large Fortune 500 retailers today. The org structure might have the CEO at the top, and then you have the EVP of stores. You might have an EVP of merchandising and EVP of supply chain, legal. And so you have this organizational structure. In my opinion, that automatically puts omni-channel initiatives at risk. Because what happens is that there's a microscopic difference between that EVP of merch and that EVP of stores. It's this small. But at my last job, where I was 5 layers away from the CEO, that microscopic change becomes huge, right? And my deep belief about omnichannel is that at its pinnacle, the retailer that does well in omnichannel, it won't be something that is actively sought over. Omnichannel success is the natural product. It's the natural byproduct when a retail organization is set up to be interconnected. So organizational structure to me is top of mind. The second thing that I think is a challenge is, hey, have we thought about how our associates are incentivized to actually act in the greater good versus the good of that individual silo? So number 2 would be, are we thinking through the actual incentives for our associates to be omnichannel? And really the third piece is, have our processes, have our operational processes caught up to actually enable being omnichannel? And that's really the third one. And let me give you an example, right? As we're starting to think about omnichannel and being digital, one of the things that we found was that we were running into our procurement guidelines in terms of how quickly we can onboard vendors or which vendors would make sense that we could do business with. So for me, it was running into these operational processes like procurement, right? That were designed, historically to make sure that the organization was protected, but it ultimately became a hindrance.
So Albert, we know that measurement is something that you're super passionate about. And then obviously we have a lot of folks in the audience that are thinking about how do we roll out some of these initiatives? How do we pilot and test? Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the best practices around kind of like bringing these things to life within the context of retail operations.
Scott, thank you for your question. There's probably very few topics that I'm more passionate about than the actual measurement and the KPIs that surround omnichannel initiatives and digital transformation experiences from a retail perspective. So let me take a step back. For me, and let me answer, think about the way that I like to think about this is with the question, right? How can we manage what we don't measure? And the answer is we can't, right? And so one of the things that I've seen in the industry today is a lot of retailers are getting credit for just merely executing and putting out experiences. But for me, the question I always wanted to answer was, does this experience or does this pilot need to live on, or does it need to die right here? So for me, let me give you a real world example, Scott. One of the projects that I worked on for the Home Depot was our pilot store. It was our Store of the Future initiative. It went live in the 2017 timeframe. But imagine this, 100 unique pilots in a single store. And again, in all of the massive mountain moving that brought that all to life. Think about it this way. Of the 100 pilots, a huge percentage of those pilots were one and done, meaning that thank you for playing, we learned a lot, but this was not going to move forward. A smaller percentage were, okay, we're going to actually expand this to a subset of the stores. We think we're onto something, it's not going to die here, we're going to expand to a subset of the chain. But Scott, a small percentage of those 100 pilots were just slam dunk, no-brainer home runs that we really wanted to make sure that we double down on. If we didn't have the right measurements in place, if we didn't have the data and the KPIs in place, we would have never been able to have those kinds of insights. So for me, when you start talking about innovation and omnichannel, right at the very first conversation, we need to also be talking about how are we measuring omnichannel and what does success look like?